Please welcome Matt O'Hayer, co-founder and chief executive officer of Vital Farms. Michael Helmstetter, founder, president, and chief executive officer, TechAccel. Aaron Schacht, vice president, global research and development and regulatory affairs, Elanco, and Eric Ward, president, AgBiome.
So good afternoon. It's Aaron Schacht here. It's my pleasure to welcome you all again. I had the great honor to welcome you all to the reception last night, which went great, by the way. And then dinners, of course, have been great. The whole summit has been great. So thanks to the Forbes people and all the co-organizers. It's been a really outstanding event. As Paul mentioned last night, the new thing added to the Forbes AgTech Summit this year is a focus on animal health. So we get our one slot in the day to talk about animal health today. I will remind everybody that animals consume about 40 to 50% of the grain produced in the continental United States, so we do care about the plant producers here as well. But we're going to dive into animal health a little bit and sort of take a look at where we are today and where this is headed from a technology and advancement, both from the more of an incremental perspective, but also from a disruptive perspective. But what I'd like to do is first introduce myself and my business, and then ask my colleagues to do the same. So I lead R&D, the innovation function at Elanco Animal Health. Elanco is a 64-year-old division of Eli Lilly company that is now its own company that stands alone. So we're a 64-year-old startup. My colleague at Corteva refers to themselves as a 100-plus-year-old startup. We don't have that quite long of a tenure, but we certainly feel like a startup right now. Our focus in business is really to enrich human lives through food and companionship. We have both a food animal business as well as a companion animal business. For the purposes of today, we'll focus on food animal only. There are some countries that consider some animals both food and companionship, and the United States is not one of them. But what we focus on really is producing products that have biological activity that improve the health and well-being of an animal, and in the context of livestock production, help the livestock producer achieve performance that they're looking for. A healthier animal produces better. A more productive animal makes the production operation stronger. So that's our focus. That's how we think about our customers. And our technologies really have been historically technologies that have come from other industries, either pharmaceutical industry or the crop science industry, and really have dealt with combating environmental concerns, bacteria, viruses, other sort of pathogens and threats. And so that's been the dominant theme of animal health, alongside a desire to make the animal produce better, achieve or exceed its own genetic potential through other kinds of biology. Some of those become controversial in nature. So that's the current state of animal health from the Elanco lens. What we have seated on the stage here is an investor, a technology company, and then ultimately a livestock producer. And so we've got the entire value chain represented here, and so maybe I'll just ask Michael to go first as the investor, and Eric as technology, and then Matt as the end stage producer.
Sure, thanks Aaron, and I want to echo, it's great to see animal health on the agenda here. So TechAccel invests in technologies in the plant and animal space, and if you look at our portfolio, it's highly dominated by crop and plant and ag chemical practices. And so kind of getting to Aaron's point of sort of the maturing of the animal health sector and ending up on stage at an event like this, we see great opportunity in animal health, animal nutrition technologies, and advancing them. Our specialty is really focusing on high-risk technologies. So if you think about Elanco, where Aaron works, they've got a prioritization, they've got an R&D budget, and over the last decade or so, companies like his have really reached out to external partnerships with others that maybe are willing to take on a little bit of risk that they can't take. So we might look at something that they would have in their portfolio that maybe doesn't fit their current pipeline or their risk profile, but may have huge potential, both from a health standpoint and a production standpoint. So we also play with universities where they've exhausted their federal funding on technologies, and you see a lot of that in the animal health space, like in vaccines. And I think, you know, one of the things I'm sure we'll talk about today is what's going on in animal health going forward, and certainly this desire to reduce antibiotic usage, but at the same time have good stewardship for the animals is kind of at a tipping point as well today. So we're kind of an investor looking at those elements of it and working with organizations like Aaron's and universities and moving technologies forward.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Aaron, again for the invitation to be on the panel today. My name's Eric Ward. I'm with a company called AgBiome. We're based in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. And we're focused on crop protection, actually. We discover novel microbes from the environment, and then we develop those into two different kinds of crop protection products. On the one hand, the live microbes themselves that we ferment at scale and then stabilize so that they can be put into the distribution channel and get applied the same way a chemical crop protectant would. In addition, we fully sequence the genomes of all of the microbes that we isolate. And our collection numbers now something in excess of 55,000 proprietary strains. And from those genome sequences, we can look for specific features that we believe will convey functionality on the microbes, as well as identify individual genes that we can deploy as GM traits in corn and soybean. So we're about 5.5 years old. We've got 85 employees roughly, have a terrific investor syndicate that backs us. We've raised 3 financing rounds to date, totaling $117 million. And you might wonder why I'm sitting up here, because this is an animal health panel, but it turns out that the microbial collection we've isolated has a lot of functionality in areas outside of our core business. So we've started a spin out already that's focused on novel genome editing technology, and we're just starting to dabble our toes in the animal health area now.
Thanks, Aaron. My name is Matt O'Hare. My company is Vital Farms. We are an egg producer, actually an egg company. We're based in Austin, Texas, but we have 140 plus farms and growing along 8 states from Kansas to Georgia in the northern part of the South. And the reason why they're in the northern part of the South is that our chickens all live outdoors during the day. And so they are what we call pasture raised. They live a pretty happy life, and they consume not just the standard diet of corn and a little bit of soybean meal, which 99% of the chickens in the United States used to eat, but they actually consume the pasture. So they got a little salad mix in there and a lot of fresh air. That ends up being a great thing from an animal welfare standpoint, but also a great thing from an animal health standpoint, because our morbidity rates are way lower than those for cage tens, or even what they call cage-free, which is basically open up the cages and jam them on a warehouse floor. So it's a different process. It requires more land. We give each of our birds 108 square feet outdoors, but a lot of the rest of it looks a lot like what you see in other farms. You know, we state-of-the-art barns themselves, with a lot of functionality around animal health and animal welfare. If you're putting your birds outside, that's not the end of animal health in our view. A lot of it has to do with making sure they stay healthy, and that there's a lot of great technology and things we can do to do that. So currently have about approaching 2 million birds on our farms, and growing rapidly around the country. We're in about 10,000 grocery stores. We have a little less than half owned by private equity, and have raised money along the way as we needed it, and we are having a lot of fun what we're doing.
Great, thank you. So I think the first topic we want to dive into today is, what technologies have we depended on? What technologies have built these industries into what they are today that now become the subject of obsolescence, because either the practices are no longer accepted from a consumer perspective, or there's better technologies coming along, new ideas, new things to respond to. So maybe I'll just open it up to the group. What do you see coming in the way of the next wave of technology that changes the practices and the tools used, the technologies applied to really address animal welfare, animal well-being, animal health?
I can take a shot at that first in terms of what we're interested in, we're investing in. Obviously the thing that's going to be the headline on what Aaron said is antibiotics. And I think in a way maybe the message, and there's been a lot of comments about GMO, gene editing, et cetera, today, going all the way back to Mr. Forbes this morning. Antibiotics is kind of in that same space, that maybe the message has been overly simplified. When you look at the idea of eliminating antibiotics, that's not good for the producer, it's not good for the animal, it's not good for the consumer. And so I think we're at a point where, and I bet you Aaron would tell you, you're really trying to look at it a hybrid approach where you're gonna, if you have a cat or a dog at home and it has an infected eye, you're gonna take it to the vet, you're gonna get antibiotics to fix that. It's not fair to the animal from a welfare standpoint if you have a production animal that has an infected eye and you don't treat that animal. And so I think there's gonna be a hybrid approach where you're still gonna have some level of antibiotic usage, but that's gonna have to be reduced. And we're very interested. We're interested in what Eric's doing with the microbiome. We're very interested in bacteriophage. Those are essentially viruses that you can target and program specific bacteria, so you're able to kind of deal with it naturally, and it's a non-infective virus. Phytochemicals, maybe using it, I don't know, but things like oregano and other herbs, thyme and such, have things they release that provide a lot of protection to animals in terms of animal health. And then probably, at least for us, most importantly is immune modulators. So the ability, and we, I don't know how many people here take vitamins or fish oil or probiotics or whatever it is, but same kind of thing with these production animals. Can you find the right brew of these things that stimulate their immune system that give them that resistance to those diseases and thus allow you to kind of use less antibiotics? And last comment I'll make, it's maybe somewhat controversial, but there's not a ton of, the reason the antibiotic reduction push is really there is a concern that you're going to get resistant bacteria in these production animals that are going to be zoonotic. That means transferred to humans. There's not a ton of science out there that says that happens on a regular basis. So again, back to the messaging, I think it's about responding appropriately to the concerns and at the same time bring in some technologies that from a consumer-facing standpoint, I take probiotics, that's great, that's what Elanco's using in some of their research programs and kind of has that overall messaging and acceptance from the consumers.
Yeah, from our perspective, if you go back 70, 80 years, cows were in fields, chickens were in pasture and around homes, and that's the way it was. After World War II, you saw the introduction of cages, where when I got into the business about 10 years ago, 95% of all laying hens were stuffed into cages with 5 or 6 or 7 other laying hens, and where they couldn't stand up all the way because it was too short, and they couldn't turn around, and they couldn't even stretch their wings, which is probably the worst, most tortured farm animal there was. But then cows have also been moved out of the pastures in a lot of areas. Most meat come from CAFOs today, concentrated feed or outfits where the birds standing there don't ever see grass other than silage. And so I think the consumers are pushing back. When I first introduced pasture-raised eggs on a commercial scale in this country, I would go to places even like Whole Foods and I said pasture-raised and they'd say pasteurized. They thought it was the same thing, and not thought it was the same thing, but never really heard of it. Today we have 2% of the egg industry in the United States and the egg business in the United States, and it's growing rapidly because of consumer pushback on concentrated forms of factory farming. So I think that's a technological change in and of itself. Also stocking densities, which is the cause of a lot of illnesses in animals overstocked. You don't get sick on an airplane. Walking in a field, you get sick on airplanes. And chickens and other forms of livestock have the same issue with these concentrated methods. And so, in a way, it's new technology to go back to the way things were, as opposed to, cutting edge tech.
Yeah. Eric, what do you see?
Yeah, when I first started to learn about this area a couple of years ago, so I'm far from an expert, but you start to read the literature and it turns out people don't actually know why antibiotics work, right? There's a bunch of theories about why they cause growth promotion, some of which are backed by a reasonable amount of data, but it's pretty clear we don't actually know. That said, it's pretty clear that there's an opportunity to do other things than just kind of broad brush eliminate big swaths of the internal microbiome. So microbes for like 3.5 billion years have been beating the crap out of each other in the environment, right? They basically engage in chemical warfare with one another. And some of them are exceptionally good at competing with other ones, in some cases in bad ways, like pathogens, in other cases in really good ways. So, we're convinced, and there's pretty good data now that we're gathering, that you can find microbes that are very effective competitors of some of the bad guys that you don't want around. So I think that's a really interesting trend to be able to take a completely naturally occurring microbe and go after specific pathogens that you know are problems in production. So that's a super encouraging trend. And the microbiome overall, you know, it's been oversold probably about as much as CRISPR and vertical farming have been in their own ways. It's incredibly complicated. The ecology, even within an organism like a human, is super complex, or a livestock animal. But we're clearly gonna be at the point in the next, I don't know, you tell me, 10 years, 15 years, when you can actually do kind of a high resolution profile of the microbiome of every animal. We're pretty far away on a cost basis from doing that now, but that was true of like genotyping crop plants 20 years ago too, right? We couldn't individually sequence at high resolution at any sort of a reasonable cost, and now you can figure out the genetic signature of an individual corn plant for a couple of cents, and that would have been, you know, thousands of dollars 20 years ago. So we'll get there on that stuff, I'm convinced.
I think it's a great insight, just to build on that. I think from the lens at Elanco, clearly if you just examine the origin of antibiotics in the first place, most of them are isolated from a natural sample containing microbes that have some biosynthetic pathway that produces some molecule that then has antimicrobial properties. It's part of the chemical warfare concept that Eric described. So if that's where that biological effect came from in the first place, then it seems reasonable to return to that place of origin and look for to unlock the secrets that address maybe the goals of what antibiotics do, but not in the way they do it precisely, that cause the concern around residues in the tissue or microbial resistance patterns that may or may not be valid scientifically or developed. But in any case, I think my point would be, if the consumers have a concern about it and technology can address it, we should adapt our efforts to embrace that and pursue that. That's how we feel about things at Elanco, even though we're well known as one of probably the most prominent medicated feed antibiotic-based company there is. We see a future beyond antibiotics and certainly want to embrace that. I think you brought up another point, Eric. You used the word higher resolution, and you brought up a concept of the industrialization of production, right? What we stand on is an industry that was built on low-resolution, brute force methods for production. And now we have technologies that allow for higher resolution understanding in terms of science and higher precision methods and more elegant applications like what you might describe. So Matt, tell me about how you're adopting technology with maybe old-school kind of concepts like how you handle the animals, but now applying technology to all the aspects of your production system.
Yeah, we love using technology to make farmers more profitable, to make our birds healthier, and to really deliver a much better product to our customer. Our farms typically would have a central barn with a huge amount of pasture around the outside that allows for that 108 square feet. And there's circumference fencing on the outside and then spoke and wheel fencing, allowing for multiple paddocks. And then the birds are moved on a regular basis, not allowed to come back to previous pasture for 60 days, so pathogens and parasites can run their life cycles. And then the barn itself, even though it seems really small in the vastness, are state-of-the-art. I mean, the chickens weigh themselves all day long by jumping up. And so we know exactly what the weights of all our birds are because the computer tells us we know that there's 2 on the scale, for example, that averages it. But that's recorded as part of the data set we collect all the time. So if a bird is 53 weeks, and the flock is 53 weeks, and the average weight is 43.5 pounds, and they're supposed to be 47 at that weight, we know there's something's going on that farm. But we don't wait that long. We get it more instantaneous. New technology we're going to be putting in will let us know by electric loads whether there's a problem with the feeding system or how much water the birds are getting or how often the farmer's coming to walk around their birds, which is part of our methods. They have to be out there with them. So we'll be able to check all those things and at the same time check the health of the pastures. We embrace every bit of technology we can.
That's great. Michael, maybe just maybe last point to you, and then we'll open the floor for some questions. The idea that technologies from one sector, let's say in agriculture, could translate into other sectors. What do you see as an investor? What are you looking for? What have you learned about maybe crop production that may translate into an interest in animal health?
That's a good question. I mean, certainly the highest one is exactly what Eric's doing on a daily basis, is this idea where he's got a company that's focused on the soil microbiome. You have Trace Genomics, who's here today, as well, talking about that and being able to transition that over to animal health. Actually, the place where we see the greatest opportunity is human health to animal health. So an example of a company that we're considering investing in here in the next month, they've got a product that's primarily Gates Foundation funded. It's a technology basically dealing with malnutrition in babies and young kids. It's a lipid matrix that allows your system to absorb all the good stuff, the fat, calories, and lipids and other things that you want to kind of give you some health from a nutrition standpoint much more readily. We want to take that and translate it into animal health, in particular swine. It's an issue with piglets and the number of piglets that don't sort of make it into the system because they're malnourished. And so that's probably one of the biggest untapped areas. Is I think the crop to animal space, because we're doing stuff like this, the Ag Showcase that was just in St. Louis had a lot of animal health. They're starting to get that dialogue going about the transition of some of these technologies and application over on the animal health side. But I think one of the greatest untapped areas, and part of it's market. You know, you think about the human health market, you talk about billions. I mean, for Aaron, a big market is $100 million. And so it's a big delta between the two. And I think that's kind of left it sort of a lack of attention from investors because of that delta. And now everybody's realizing the potential and the breadth of what's there. And you have the human pharma companies and others that just have not paid attention to the smaller animal health market where it really can transition and translate over. So I think there's a huge opportunity. Aaron's company certainly is a leader in kind of looking in that space with Eli Lilly as the backbone of Elanco. And I think we need more of that, and we need more investors who are willing to take risks on the animal health side of the business that may not be as well established as the human health side.
Great. Why don't we pause here and take some questions if there are any? I'll threaten additional boring prompts if we don't get a question. Okay. So let's talk about gene editing and where that's going and how we think that's going to play in animal health. Matt, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on gene editing. The idea that we change the genetic makeup of the animal in precise ways to do certain specific things.
Well, from a marketing perspective, it's a tough one because genetics have a negative image when it comes to food, as you were talking about earlier. We're really interested from our perspective that anything that could produce a great chicken that at the same time will lay enough eggs to make the farmer profitable and still have the characteristics of going out on pasture. So that's more breeding than genetics in a sense, and anything that would allow us not to have to vaccine, for example. Vaccinations are expensive. It introduces something foreign into the birds' bodies, and if we can do that with having birds that are resistant or to avian influenza, to salmonella, we spend an enormous amount of money testing for all these things. Salmonella has to be tested multiple times during the life cycle of the hens from the time they're chicks. And that would, if there was a salmonella-resistant hen, we'd be really excited about that. So we follow that closely from the characteristics we're looking for in the birds and meeting all the different criteria that would make it. But I think the challenge is consumer acceptance.
Yeah. Good. Any other thoughts?
I'll just comment that it is really about messaging. Personally, I think it's a matter of time because, again, if you can go in and use a tool like CRISPR or something else that's a gene editing tool where you're going in and making an edit in the target of interest, if you could make that one edit so you didn't have to use antibiotics or use any of these other things we talked about, where does that balance out in sort of consumer preference? And you have the challenges of cloning Dolly and those kinds of things that's sort of viewed as gene editing, but this potential to be able to go in and make some rather unique genetic changes to that species, to that animal, and be able to get that resistance that you're looking for that would eliminate a whole host of other things. Again, it's back to success and messaging with the consumer that's the ultimate driver of those technologies. I think it's a matter of time, in my opinion, before comes
Yeah, I
to
would
mind.
agree with that completely. The big challenge with genome editing that people don't talk about generally is what target do you want to go after? And it's not as simple as just mapping the gene and saying, okay, I know this gene has an emphasis on or influence on this phenotype. You have to know the exact change you want to make down to the base pair. And I know, for instance, in major crop species, corn and soybean, there might be maybe 20, maybe 40 genes that are known at that level of resolution. So, the hardest part is actually picking the change you want to make. That said, we'll get there for sure in the animal side. And I think that's going to be one of the places where we see the technology most adopted, right? There's a huge ethical issue, which is insolvable, and I hope is never a boundary that's crossed, altering the germline of humans. But there's absolutely no reason why we wouldn't alter the germline of, poultry or cattle or something, right? If it actually improves the species in a way that makes production more sustainable and leads to fewer inputs. So I'm optimistic we're going to see it. But as these guys said, every technology curve adoption is driven by regulatory acceptance and ultimately by consumer acceptance. So it's got to be there for the stuff to eventually catch on. It can really slow it down.
Great, very insightful. Maybe last concept of disruption. How do we think about the replacement of animals as the source of protein?
I've been a non-meat eater since 1974, so since that time, I've had millions of different types of veggie burgers, and the ketchup and tomatoes and bun really are great. But I was at a darkened theater, Alamo Draft House, a couple weeks back, and I ordered a Beyond Meat burger, and I couldn't see it, but as I was eating, when I took the first bite, I thought it was back in 1973. I just had my first, so it's pretty astounding what they're doing today with plant-based foods, and I think it's a great thing. The amount of farmland we use and the ratio of grains to the amount of meat produced is absurd, and what it's doing to the environment and its contribution to global warming is tremendous. So anything we can do and plus the health aspect. I'm sure there's lots of opinions on whether meat is good for you in this room, but not among a lot of cardiologists. And I think that anything we can do to move towards plant-based eating is great. So.
Yeah, as an investor, it's an interesting area. I mean, the demand for protein is skyrocketing because of the increase of the middle class globally. So something's got to happen. When you saw Tyson go into Beyond Meat, you saw Cargill go into Memphis Meats. I mean, that's a real indicator of how seriously the system is taking these alternative meats. For us, it's more of a timeline perspective because I think we're expecting it to go into specialty grocery stores and probably restaurants where you might be paying a little premium to get that unique piece of meat that's done a certain way, and that's going to kind of be the first test bed of again, back to, after regulatory, the consumer acceptance and adoption piece that then does go more widespread. And the estimates are that's probably at 3 to 5 years out. So again, I think it is something that it will happen. We'll see it in the specialty grocery stores on the restaurant menus, and I agree. I think we need it. It's just a matter of sort of right now the economics and time.
Yeah, do you think that the rate of improvement of production methods using animals will be exceeded by, right, the rate of introduction of an alternate source? That's maybe the question that'd be interesting to hear thoughts on.
Yeah, that's in the sort of science fiction circles, right? If you think about the world of, a lab-grown meat, which that's probably not how it should be branded based on Steve Forbes' comments this morning.
Based on what I experienced in a lab, I wouldn't brand it that way.
But if, at some point, energy is infinitely cheap and has zero CO2 load on the environment, like from nuclear fusion, I think you actually could produce laboratory cells and culture cheaper and more efficiently than you could grow an animal in a field. Right now, I don't see how it's possible. It's much like the indoor farming movement. If you have access to very, very inexpensive power, you can make the economic work in very high-value crops. But for all their inefficiencies, animals are pretty damn good at converting plant matter into high-quality protein, right?
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, we got a minute left. Any questions from the audience?
one over
Otherwise,
here.
we'll draw this to a close. We've got one.
Just quick follow-up on that particular point. Should it be called meat? And should almond milk be called milk?
Well, I hail from the state of Missouri. We're in Kansas City, Missouri, and we're proud to be the first state that's going to go ahead and label alternative meat, which has already got multiple lawsuits associated with it. So that's a great question. I mean, there's a lot of debate, dairy, meat, milk, what does that hold? And unfortunately, at least in our state, we're seeing that's going to go to the courts, essentially, a lot like GMO labeling that's there as well. So that's going to be a big debate. That's going to influence consumer adoption and preference. And again, for those companies that are in this, they've got to forecast what that's going to look like.
And if it's grown in a lab, is it agriculture? Maybe that's an interesting question. So did you have a thought, Matt?
Down to 0.
We're down to 0. That's a great thought. Thank you all very much.
Thanks.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.